Let's revisit what we have learned from episode 1 to episode 7 in this week. If you place 7 philosophers in a room, something interesting happens. Not because they agree, but because they disagree in fascinating ways. This week, we traveled through centuries of philosophy, from ancient Athens to the modern world. And if you step back for a moment, a pattern begins to appear. It almost feels like a long conversation. And in many good conversations, it begins with a slightly annoying person asking too many questions. Remember episode 1? That person was Socrates. Socrates did something simple but revolutionary. He refused to accept answers that sounded convincing but weren't carefully examined. He walked around Athens politely dismantling people's certainty, which is both a noble philosophical method and a very effective way to make enemies. But Socrates started something important. He suggested that living thoughtfully might matter more than living comfortably. And that's why he chose to die with poison rather than fleeing from the prison. We'll discuss that in later episodes, that how did Socrates died. So Socrates opened the door to philosophy. Once that door was open, philosophy never really stopped asking uncomfortable questions. Centuries later, another philosopher pushed this discomfort even further. That philosopher was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche looked at Western civilization and noticed something strange. For centuries, people believed their values came from a divine source. Morality felt stable because it seemed anchored in something eternal. But Nietzsche suspected that the anchor was quietly disappearing. His famous statement, "God is dead," wasn't a celebration. It was more like a warning. If the old foundations collapse, humanity suddenly became responsible for creating meaning on its own. Which sounds empowering until you realize how heavy that responsibility is. And that is exactly where another thinker enters the story, Albert Camus. Camus looked at this situation and said something brutally honest. Maybe the universe simply doesn't provide the answers we are looking for. Humans want meaning. The universe offers silence. That gap between our desire for purpose and world's indifference is what Camus called the absurd. Yet strangely, Camus did not respond with despair. His response was something closer to quiet rebellion. If the universe refuses to give us meaning, then we can still choose how we face that fact. Somewhere between laughter and defiance. But philosophy does not only question meaning. Sometimes it questions reality itself, which is exactly what Plato explored in his famous Allegory of the Cave. Plato suggested something deeply unsettling. What we call reality might actually be a set of shadows. And the moment someone tries to show us a deeper truth, our first instinct may not be curiosity. It may be resistance, because leaving the cave is uncomfortable. And people rarely enjoy discovering that their certainty was built on illusions. Yet, philosophy is not always dramatic metaphysics and cosmic meaning. Sometimes it becomes intensely practical. That is where the Stoics entered the scene. One of the most remarkable teachers, Epictetus, had a surprisingly simple insight. Much of our suffering comes from fighting battles we cannot possibly win, trying to control things that are simply not ours to control. The Stoics suggested something radical in its simplicity. Focus on your choices. Let the rest of the universe do whatever it was going to do anyway. Which, if you think about it, might be one of the most calming ideas philosophy ever produced. But philosophy also has a habit of turning inward. And when it did, René Descartes asked a question that changed modern thought. What if everything we believe could be doubted? Our senses deceive us, dreams feel real, even reality might be a grand illusion. But Descartes discovered one thing that doubt itself could not destroy. If you are doubting, then you must exist in order to do the doubting. And from that tiny island of certainty came his famous conclusion, cogito ergo sum. which means I think, therefore I am. It was an elegant solution. But philosophy rarely allows elegant solutions to rest peacefully. Soon, another philosopher quietly raised his hand, David Hume. Hume examined the mind closely and noticed something curious. Whenever he looked for the self that René Descartes seemed so certain about, he could not find it. Instead, David Hume found thoughts, memories, emotions, sensations, a constantly shifting stream of experiences. And Hume wondered whether the self might simply be the story we tell to organize those experiences, not a fixed object, but a moving collection, almost like a river pretending to be a statue. So, after this week's journey through the philosophy, something interesting became clear. These thinkers were not solving a puzzle, they were expanding it. Each philosopher opened a new door. Socrates questioned certainty, Nietzsche questioned values, Camus questioned meaning, Plato questioned reality, Epictetus questioned our emotional struggles, Descartes questioned knowledge, and Hume questioned the self. Which leaves us in a rather fascinating position, surrounded by brilliant minds and still asking questions. But perhaps that is exactly the point. Philosophy doesn't give us a comfortable map of the universe. It gives us a better compass. And sometimes that compass is far more useful than the map.